This video is brought to you by Skillshare. Become a member for free for 2 months with the link down below. One of the greatest things about PC gaming is access to a really long backlog of games from previous generations. Usually, a PC game has to be really old for it to no longer work in your computer, and often it comes down to some OS compatibility issue, or a dead DRM or a dead online service, which often can be remedied. In the realm of consoles, things are not as simple. Let's say, hypothetically, that you really like a certain game series, and there are games on that series are exclusive to consoles, and some of those consoles have been out of production for a while. Unless there's a remake or remaster, you're forced to hunt down a used copy and then find a working compatible console with all the trouble that comes with it, especially when backwards compatibility is not something you can always take for granted. And since these games are only made to work on a console and it's a specific architecture, there is no way to natively run them on PC. So how about we use a program that runs an entire virtual console of sorts, and then that virtual console runs the game. Welcome to the fascinating world of emulators. Marvelous programs created by brilliant and intrepid programmers to simulate the old consoles and run their games. Now, as some of you know, I tend to avoid the topic of emulators on PC due to their complicated legal status. Every time I bring this topic up, I am bombarded by conflicting information on all sides, and it is really hard to figure out what is actually going on. If only I knew of some lawyer who was also a YouTuber and had a catchy superhero-like name.
I sense that someone needs legal advice!
Oh look, if it isn't Devin from Legal, the YouTube channel where a real lawyer analyzes movies and shows from a legal perspective, examines the realism of legal procedures in media, and examines real-world law. How convenient. Mind giving me a hand with this issue?
Yeah, thanks for the kind words, Alex. The reason that this all seems complicated and confusing is that it's all very complicated and very confusing. So it's not surprising that a lot of people often get this wrong, and a lot of the law related to emulation and ROMs is not really particularly tested in the United States. But at base, the thing that most people get wrong that they need to remember is that video games are art. Video games are copyrightable in the same way that a movie is copyrightable or a song is copyrightable. So if it's clear that you can't share a movie or a song legally, you probably can't share a ROM of a video game in the same way. And it gets more complicated than that because, generally speaking, in the United States, emulators themselves, the actual software that does the emulating, is legal. It's okay, generally speaking, to have a piece of software that emulates another piece of hardware. Now, there are exceptions to that. But just because the emulator itself is legal absolutely does not mean that the ROM is legal. And it also doesn't mean that you were legally able to create that ROM in the first place. A lot of people will claim that if you actually own the cartridge or video game itself, that you're legally allowed to make a ROM from that cartridge, and that's probably not even the case either. A lot of people will point to a portion of the Copyright Act which deals with fair use, specifically 17 U.S.C. 117. That particular aspect of copyright law allows you to make what's called an archival copy. It's not really tested, but it probably doesn't apply in this case. For one, you're not really making an archival copy when you make a ROM. Really what you're trying to do is space shifting, which is what Napster argued a few years ago when they said that you own the copy of the song from the CD, you're just simply shifting the space in which you are listening to it. And the court didn't agree. The court said that that was an illegal derivative copy and that you weren't allowed to do that, even if you own the actual CD itself. It's possible, and this is relatively untested, that that applies to ROMs as well. So the bottom line is that while emulators are probably legal, and that's probably still an open question, making the ROMs themselves or possessing the ROMs probably isn't. It's probably copyright infringement. It probably does not qualify as an archival copy. And even if it did, odds are that the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyrights anti-circumvention protections might apply and might get you into trouble anyway. So that's a long way of saying that it's a complicated and complex area of the law that is relatively untested, that there's a lot of bad information out there, and there aren't going to be a lot of clear answers. You're welcome.
Thanks, Devin. Make sure to check the Legal YouTube channel. He will make you passionate for legal issues that you would have thought boring before. Now, emulators are an important part of gaming culture because as time passes and hardware becomes broken, emulators are fundamentally important for the preservation of older games. Emulators are also an interesting piece of technology. When trying to emulate a game, it is easy to simply read some approximate specification of the power level of an old console, compare it to a modern PC, and think it's not a big deal, but you will probably be wrong. Since running an emulator is not simply like running a native PC game, but rather going through the process of almost recreating a virtual version of the console and then running a game on it, the performance overhead can be massive. A rule of thumb usually mentioned in these discussions is that to emulate a system, you often need a computer 10 to 20 times more powerful than the original system, and even something as broad as that has to be taken with a grain of salt, as emulation overhead varies tremendously depending on code optimizations, how different the target machine is from a PC, and a million other factors. Still, as a technical challenge, it is tremendously interesting. We know computing has made tremendous advances in the last decade, and it is amazing to think that some of the best computers out there are powerful enough to do impressive things regarding emulation. But yeah, powerful expensive computers have lots of power, big fucking deal. But how has technology progressed on the cheaper side of the spectrum? I keep bringing up the Athlon 3000G because people will not click a video if I'm not using it. I keep bringing up the Athlon 3000G because it is very representative of the way entry-level PC components seem to continue increasing in power. It uses an architecture for its CPU and GPU that, while not bleeding edge, is modern enough to incorporate a lot of the optimizations that allow getting the most power out of each core. Since this is a bit behind the current AMD generation, it is very probable that they have already mastered their production and can make them very cheaply. In fact, I will not be surprised if these are made from Ryzen and Vega cores that has some defect and gets them repurposed. Since AMD has gotten a bit crazy with the core counts lately, having a couple of decent cores is barely an expense or an issue, and since these cores were designed to work in much higher amounts, the thermal overhead of using just a couple is kinda insane, which is likely why you can overclock it so easily. As technology trickles down and the expensive components give way to innovation on the lower end, I start asking myself, is a $50 CPU and GPU in 2020 10 to 20 times more powerful than a console that was hundreds of dollars in 1995, 2000, 2006? I will be running this whole thing in the setup worthy of the title of budget PC, as it runs in a cheap B350 motherboard, a cheap power supply, a cheap SSD, and RAM at 2666 MHz, all built together into an Amazon box instead of a case, which even with the very evident airflow issues can easily overclock to 3.9 GHz for the CPU and 1.6 GHz for the GPU. If you wonder why there's a PC built into a box, a couple of pals from the Spanish tech YouTube scene were visiting recently and needed to borrow a bunch of low-end components for a number of videos. And after I look at the final result they built, I just could not drive myself to take it apart because of just how fun it looks, even if it's terribly inconvenient to use. Enough side notes, let's start with the old days. The start of 3D home console graphics in 1995 and 1996. The Nintendo 64 was notoriously tricky to program for, and its specs seem funny when looking in retrospective, but they were actually pretty powerful for its time, just limited by its cartridge format. Interestingly enough, most games here run at 320 by 240 and occasionally 640 by 480, and it reached frame rates that were often closer to 20 FPS more than they were to 30. And they say I am crazy. It was a wild time and everyone was willing to do sacrifices for 3D. Emulating a Nintendo 64 is, to no one's surprise, relatively easy. A cheap phone can probably do it, and an Athlon 3000G can easily do it at a much higher HD-like resolution like 2080 by 960, while enhancing anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering. This is running on Project 64. There are patches to unlock better performance, but it runs at least as well as it did on the original console. Not much of a surprise. The PlayStation is often argued as less powerful than the Nintendo 64, but with much superior distribution medium, and will output a similar 256 to 224 to 640 to 480. But what does power matter 2 decades later? Metal Gear Solid is a game that was tremendously innovative at the time and continues to be a fascinating piece of media. While it did eventually receive a PC port that is suspiciously absent from any digital game distribution service, it was originally a PlayStation 1 game, and using the EPSXE emulator, it can easily run at 4 times the original PlayStation resolution. It can be a bit jarring to look at its graphics without the benefit of a lower resolution, but I still think it looks neat. That was easy. Let's jump one generation and see how we will do. The GameCube used a PowerPC architecture meant to be easier to develop than the Nintendo 64 while still being small and powerful, outputting all games at 640 by 480, the maximum resolution that only a handful of Nintendo 64 games ever did. Emulating GameCube is still significantly harder due to the increased complexity, but a tremendous amount of resources and time have been spent by the community to the task. The Dolphin emulator is very effective, very stable, and performs really well. For this test, I ran F-Zero at 3 times the internal resolution to basically make it HD, and DirectX as its renderer, and it ran perfectly, only running occasionally into some of the video or audio stutter that is typical of emulation. For this test, I chose F-Zero for several reasons. First, it's a fantastic game, and I think one of the most underappreciated titles of this generation, and it was the last time we ever saw an F-Zero game. And hey Nintendo, if you copyright claim this video because you're making a new F-Zero game, I wouldn't even be mad. Second, it was a title that natively ran at 60 FPS on GameCube, which exemplifies the rising complexity of this generational skip and could present a challenge for emulation, but nope, it's business as usual. And consider that I'm using the latest stable build for Dolphin, which is older, and the beta releases have some great performance improvements. On the other side, there's the PlayStation 2, the best-selling console of all time. It could be argued that it was weaker than GameCube, but this was still during a time where all the consoles were so architecturally different from each other that making direct comparisons was very tricky. It still outputs at the same resolution as the GameCube, 640 by 480. From an emulator side, however, this console is extremely interesting. For the longest time, PlayStation 2 emulation had a reputation of being significantly CPU heavy. So there's a lot to be said about the trickling down of technology when a modern, cheap dual-core seems to have no issue playing Metal Gear Solid 3, which was never released on PC. Seriously. This is doubly interesting for a number of reasons. On the original PlayStation 2, this game was running at 480p and 30 FPS. The emulator is running it at 3 times the native resolution and 60 FPS with only suspicious slowdowns during certain cutscenes. Looking at the resource usage, there's still a surprisingly amount of computing power left from the CPU and GPU, so it is not as bad as I could initially assume. It is fascinating to me that this once CPU-heavy task is accomplished by what so many people consider a pretty weak dual-core CPU. Let's do a short detour before jumping on to the next generation. The Nintendo Wii cemented Nintendo's strategies of abandoning the competition and raw computing power to instead focus on unique value propositions. While technically a next-generation console, the Wii was focused on controls, and therefore often was compared to a couple of GameCubes taped together in terms of power. It still outputs 480p, just with anamorphic widescreen, and can be emulated by the same emulator that does GameCube. Unsurprisingly, this is still perfectly achievable with 3 times the internal resolution for our dear Athlon. This is as far as I feel risking the Nintendo emulators for now, since their lawyers are always watching, but I have saved the best for last. The PlayStation 3 release was a fascinating case study. It took the market's obsession for graphical improvement to the max, delivering a console that was so expensive it became a meme.
PlayStation 3 will retail for $599 US, $599 US, $599 US, $599.
Man, the internet was so different back then. It sported a processor that was so advanced at the time that literally the United States Air Force built a supercomputer using 1,500 PlayStations to analyze like satellite imagery? What? And it was also apparently so complicated to code that it took developers years to actually start making graphically impressive titles. So of course, the efforts to emulate this tech nightmare box have been intense and fascinating. RPCS3 is a fantastic open source project that is trying to achieve this very thing. Now, while I do not want to downplay the achievement that is this emulator, I do wanted to make it clear that we're starting to get into the territory of extreme active development. When considering the increasing computational power required, you have to think that this is the generation that finally jumped to HD, and that meant a huge change in pixel count. Even without considering the topic of performance, a significant number of PS3 games are still not emulable. In fact, picking a game to test here was an interesting challenge because a large number of the best-selling titles of the platform is just stuff that is on PC and you can get off GOG or Steam. When you narrow the search for exclusives, a large number of the best titles are labeled as being able to boot, but with bugs that prevent the title from being completed. And again, I don't want to downplay the achievement this emulator does, but keep in mind that this is along the limits of what we can reasonably emulate. If you jump one generation, there is no working emulator for PS4, no matter what some malware online and fakes make you believe. However, at the time of writing, one game that is fully playable is the original Demon's Souls, and as someone who really likes the Soulsborne's franchise, plus Sekiro, I am totally counting Sekiro, and is constantly frustrated that some of the games are not available on PC, the fact that Demon's Souls, which has never been released in any other console, can be emulated is very interesting. And the Athlon gets so tantalizingly close to being able to do it. This game runs natively on the PS3 at 720p and 30 FPS, and when the emulator misses the 30 FPS lock, the audio can glitch quite a bit. So it's not like you can power through it at 22 FPS like you can do so many other PC games. As you can see by the CPU usage, what we are running into is a very clear case of not enough CPU power to deal with the emulation overhead. I often get asked to do videos on graphical tweaking of emulated games, but since these were games that were not designed to have graphical settings, the methods to do so are limited and often non-existent. Here I was using the Vulkan renderer, which does improve performance a fair bit, but there is very little that can be done with just a basic lack of CPU power. And yet, this is honestly significantly closer to a working state than I expected out of this component. Put it this way, let's make an extra experiment and add one more thing. On our previous video, I found a bare bones kit that allowed me to build a tiny PC powered by a Ryzen 3 3200G, whose usability I cannot overestimate. Ever since I built it for that video, it has never left my desk. I even use it as a Linux gaming experiment, and I keep finding new uses for it. Seriously, it was a great build. I am now going to find further use for it by running the exact same experiment and configuring it for PS3 emulation, and discovering that I can also now use this small box to plug it into my TV and play Demon's Souls. The jump to a newer 12nm architecture plus the 2 extra cores makes all the difference in the world, while still being a good example of the principle of technological improvement that I keep mentioning. The 3200G is a generation behind the CPU architectures of mainstream Ryzen CPUs, and is therefore able to be produced at a very competitive price, which is all the more impressive when you see it emulated in a machine that was marketed to be bleeding edge of console graphical technology 14 years ago. So while it is easy to dismiss some of the newer, cheaper components during the hype building up to a new generational release, it is interesting to track how new technologies trickle down into cheaper, more accessible parts that are still theoretically many times stronger than top-of-the-line hardware from a decade and a half ago. And that is pretty neat. And if I can add a secondary conclusion to this, is that emulators and their development are tremendously important for game preservation, and honestly, anyone who has contributed to an open source emulator project has my respect, and my money in some cases. PS4 emulation is still a long way to go, but I'm willing to wait. Just you wait, my love. I'm still far, but I will be coming for you someday. In the meantime, if you want to contribute to open source emulation projects, you can do so with your time and skills instead of money. If you don't have any skills, then there are ways to develop them. For example, this intro to user design and usability that is necessary when you want to learn anything about user interfaces, which every project will always use. Especially when emulators can have a bit of a steep learning curve. How about any other skill? Joe the LowSpec editor mainly uses Adobe Premiere to edit, so I needed to get the basics of it fast in order to work better with him, so I took this course, Premiere Pro in 45 minutes by documentary maker Dandan Liu. And man, did that title live up to its name, because in 40 minutes, I was working. Dandan Liu also has a great course on color correction that I did last year. Anyway, the point on this whole segue is that every time I need to learn something new for my work, my first stop these days is Skillshare, this video sponsor, and maybe you should consider doing the same. Skillshare is an online learning community for creatives where millions come together to take the next step in their creative journey. It offers thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people on topics including illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and more. Skillshare has classes to fit your schedule and skill level, as I think I have demonstrated. Skillshare is also incredibly affordable, especially when compared to pricey in-person classes and workshops. An annual subscription is less than $10 a month, and I can make it cheaper for you. The first 500 of my subscribers to click in the link in the description and screen will get a 2-month free trial of premium membership, so you can start learning stuff fast. Go show them some love. They have been supporting creators like me for a long time now. Thank you to them for sponsoring this video and you for watching.